there were probably a monotheist majority in most or all parts of the peninsula, consisting of not only Jews and Christians, but also pagan monotheists. And pagan monotheism is a concept used in scholarship to describe various groups and individuals in late antiquity, and especially in Near East. It would seem that there was this phenomena in the 4th, 5th, 6th century that people, even though they did not formally convert to Judaism and Christianity, they still accepted, to some degree at least, the idea of there being only one God.
Peace, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Real Talk Podcast with Tehran and Roxana on Skeps Islamica, where we bring you innovative perspectives in Islamic studies. Today, we're discussing a fascinating book about the early Islamic community and its social and religious context, titled Muhammad and His Followers in Context, The Religious Map of Late Antique Arabia, written by our guest, Dr. Ilkka Lindstedt of Helsinki University. And we'd like to take a moment and welcome Dr. Lindstedt and thank him for accepting our invitation. Thank you for accepting our invitation to our platform.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. I'm a huge fan of the channel.
Thank you. Likewise, we're huge fans of your work, especially after reading your book, and we recommend all of our audience to go and read your work after they watch the podcast, hopefully. But Dr. Lindstedt's book emphasizes the importance of understanding the Prophet Muhammad's and his followers within their Arabian milieu. Supported by epigraphic and contemporary sources, it reconstructs and contextualizes the early reception of Muhammad's revelation, the Qur'an. Exploring how Jews, Christians, and Gentiles in Mecca, Medina, and beyond perceived his message. Additionally, the book examines the composition of the early Muslim community, considering its social, ethnic, and religious dynamics. So, to kick off our discussion, could you share with us what motivated you to write this book?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in the past decade or so, there has been a wealth of new epigraphic evidence that has come to light, especially from Saudi Arabia. And especially pre-Islamic evidence, which has been there has been very limited amount of it so far, up till 2010s, basically. And I was just wondering that someone should write a book that contextualizes the Prophet Muhammad's life and early Islam in light of this new epigraphic evidence. And as I was reflecting on that, I thought at some point that maybe that person should be me. And then I started writing the book, and especially trying to focus on the contemporary evidence that we have. And also, of course, taking into account important Muslim sources, the Quran, the Constitution of Medina, and early Islamic epigraphic evidence, in addition to the pre-Islamic epigraphic record that I put forward. So I had basically two audiences in mind when I was writing the book, and I don't know how well I succeeded, but basically first, Islamic studies scholars who naturally know Muslim sources very well, but they are not usually very well acquainted with pre-Islamic Arabian material record, what is out there, especially the newest material that has been published in especially 2010s, so very new stuff. Second, sort of the students of religious studies, Islamic studies, and then also the general public. So those I had in mind when writing the book. And what I really wanted to do is write a continuous history of Arabia, from especially sort of social history, religious history point of view, where I start around the year 300 Common Era and end 700 Common Era. And I think one of the pitfalls and problems in the field at the moment is that there's still this idea that the pre-Islamic period is vastly different from Islamic era. So I wanted to sort of problematize that a little bit, at least. And I also wanted to note that even if we limit ourselves to contemporary evidence or semi-contemporary evidence, written in Syriac, for instance. I discuss some of that in chapters 7 and 8 of my book. Even if we limit to the contemporary evidence, we have quite a bit of that to contextualize and study the history of Muhammad and his movement, his followers. So indeed, I actually think that we have much more contemporary material, or nearly so, to study the history of Muhammad than we have to study the history of Jesus. So that's something that I had in mind when writing the book.
And in terms of evidence, you prioritize the use of epigraphic evidence in your work. Why do you believe inscriptions are historically valuable? How do you address challenges such as inherent biases and limited contextual information often associated with them to make them a more valuable historical source?
Right, right. Well, let me start by emphasizing that I think that inscriptions are a great source for doing grassroots history. If we want to do sort of history from below, those are really great evidence when it comes to late antique Arabia. I mean, we don't have any papyri from this period from Arabia that survives. We have, of course, some Quranic manuscripts from the 7th century that survive in parchment, but we don't have, from Arabia, we don't really have anything else. We don't have letters and that sort of thing, which we have from Egypt, for instance. So if we want to concentrate in Arabia, inscriptions are a great source to use, I think. Many of them are graffiti, non-commissioned inscriptions that are written by sort of nobodies, in the sense that their names are not recorded in, say, Arabic historiography or some other source. So what we have of them is just this one or maybe two pieces of graffiti. And I mean, they are real material evidence that survives from this period and are very valuable, in my opinion, to study the possible religious change that was undergoing in late antique Arabia. As I suggest in the book, there was a tendency even before Islam for monotheist beliefs to become very fashionable and very common, in fact, dominant forms of religious life in Arabia, I would say. So for the spread of Christianity, for instance, I think in addition to, of course, literary sources, which we have in Arabic, Greek, and Syriac for this period, graffiti and inscriptions in general are a very good way of trying to reconstruct what was going on in Arabia at the time. Of course, we don't have so much of this evidence. We're talking about, if we take into account the Arabic and Sabaic inscriptions between 400 and 600, say, Common Era, we are talking about maybe 200 inscriptions. So that's not a whole lot, but that's still something. And that's much more than they used to be known in, say, early 2000s. So I think there's real promise there. And what is also interesting and important here to notice is that every time when people go out on the field in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, other countries, they come back with new inscriptions. So it's not exhausted yet. There's still much more material to be found. That said, I definitely understand that there are limits to this source set. And one should use as much as possible other sources, such as literary sources, to sort of triangulate the data, the epigraphic data that we have in light of other evidence. And that, I think, is very important. As regards to limited contextual information, that is true that in some cases we only have a photography of an inscription and we don't really know where this even comes from. A scholar or maybe an amateur found it and it's only stated that it comes from near Tabuk, for instance. But in many cases, this comes from academic field surveys that are collaborations usually between Saudi scholars and then, say, French scholars. French scholars have been really active in Saudi Arabia, so that's why I'm mentioning them here. So they are very well recorded, and we know the context. And I mean, these are well-known scholars who publish this material. So in many cases, we actually have quite a bit of sort of contextual information of them as well. But yeah, in a way, it's a limited source set, but it also has there's a lot of value in them, and also in the sense that it's a growing corpus of texts then there's also a lot of promise for future research, I think.
I have to say that it's an exciting field of study, and I'm a bit envious of people living in the Gulf who are able to just go out and, even if they can't read the inscriptions, at least look at them and photograph them and put them online for other academics to benefit from. So yes, it seems like a very exciting field at the moment and yielding a lot of interesting finds.
Yeah, and one thing which I think is important to note is that we haven't, at least the scholars haven't identified any fakes yet. So this is real evidence from, say, 5th or 6th centuries. Of course, at some point, if these things gain monetary value, there might have been sort of a development where people go out there and try to create fakes and then sell them, maybe if they are on a stone that can be carried away and then sold on black market, then maybe at some point there might be this sort of development, but fortunately so far we haven't seen that.
One thing you note is that almost none of these inscriptions stem specifically from Mecca or Medina in terms of locality, because no systematic sort of epigraphic surveys have been carried out in that region. How has this impacted our ability to be able to sort of accurately reconstruct the emergence of Islam's context?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and an important one as well. I mean, yeah, it is very true that near Mecca or Medina or in those cities, no systematic epigraphic fieldwork has not really been carried out. Actually, while I was writing those lines, basically in my book, Ahmed al-Jalad and Hatham Sidki were carrying out epigraphic fieldwork between Taif and Mecca, and they have published some material, some new material, which I think is important. They're 3 inscriptions, which are all monotheist in nature, which once again speaks to this development which I see happening during late antiquity, when forms of monotheism start to spread in Arabian Peninsula, and it would seem even in Mecca. I'm glad to see that there's new evidence from regions that are closer to Mecca and Medina that has now surfaced and been published. I'm also glad that sort of agrees with the thesis that I'm putting forward in the book. So that has been nice to notice. But it is definitely true that for Mecca and Medina, this is still a shortcoming that allows for, I suppose, then for a number of different reconstructions. And Stephen Shoemaker, for instance, for one, has suggested that in Mecca and Medina we should not think that there were any Christians around, or not many Christians around, at least. But if you look at the map, if we for a minute, if we focus on Christian inscriptions in particular, inscriptions written by Christians, that is, we have these Christian inscriptions both in Sabbaic and Arabic to the north and to the south of Mecca and Medina. It would be kind of weird if Mecca and Medina was this island that was cut out from the rest of Arabian Peninsula, and that you wouldn't see the same, or at least similar, religious trajectories that were happening elsewhere in Arabia, also in Mecca and Medina. So I'm suggesting at least that probably in Mecca and Medina as well, there was a sizable Jewish, Christian, pagan monotheist population. Of course, it's impossible to gauge any numbers since we don't have any quantitative material, but that's at least my hypothesis at the moment. And I also interpret the Quran in that light, that it also is evidence of Jews and Christians in those 2 towns.
Other than inscriptions, one of the other sources that you sort of use quite heavily is poetry. why, in your view, does poetry offer a crucial source for our understanding of the religious communities in Arabia? Does it present a similar picture as the epigraphic evidence? And do you think what is your view of how authentic the poetic corpus is? Like, do you believe that it has been altered in any way, sort of in its transmission and preservation?
Yeah. Pre-Islamic poetry, or the supposed pre-Islamic poetry, is a corpus of texts that I have sort of shied away for a number of years, because even though I like it as literature, I studied it as a student, but because of the issues around authenticity, I really wanted to keep that aside for a number of years. But in especially 2010s and 2020s, there has been, I would say, a growing consensus among scholars that actually much, or maybe the majority of pre-Islamic poetry is actually pre-Islamic, it's authentic. Studies by, for instance, Nicholas Sinai, Peter Webb, has argued for this, and I think that especially if you compare the religious picture arising from the poetry to the epigraphic record and see that those actually align quite well, that speaks to and is evidence of the authenticity of pre-Islamic Arabic corpus, I mean poetical corpus. So pre-Islamic Arabic poetry is heavily monotheist. There's very few references to other deities than Allah or Al-Ilah or Al-Rab, different appellations to the one God. And in the 1920s, for instance, there were some scholars, and in the 20th centuries, who thought that this fact, this monotheist, the majority monotheist nature in poetry actually belies its authenticity. So it rejects, on the basis of that notion, they rejected the authenticity of this poetical corpus, because people at the time, based on in particular Arabic historiographical sources, thought that on the eve of Islam, Arabia must have been heavily polytheist, heavily idolatrous. So because the poetry doesn't align with that view, then it has to be rejected as authentic material. Now, when this new epigraphic material has surfaced and has been published, now we actually know that that's not the case. And I suggest that polytheists were in the minority. There might have been some, but they were in the minority. So if you keep that in mind, then poetry actually aligns quite well with that image or reconstruction arising from the epigraphic record. And then that makes me think that maybe other not only that aspect in the poetical corpus, but also the poetical corpus in its totality might be authentic, or at least contain authentic verse. And I really think that the majority of the poetical corpus, especially in the so-called sort of specialized poetry collections, the Diwans, it's authentic. Even the pre-Islamic material, also of course the Islamic era material. So if that is accepted, then of course that corpus can also be used as a contemporary source to reconstruct religious trajectories, for instance. Of course, it can be used for other things as well. Nadia Jamil has used it to reconstruct sort of ethical discourse in pre-Islamic Arabia in a very fine book. So it's of course a very rich corpus of texts. So especially when it comes to Mecca, Medina, for which, like I mentioned, we don't have good, at least epigraphic record for the period before Islam, then to sort of understand the religious groups and phenomena in those towns, I turn to the Arabic poetical corpus, because there are some mentions, some references to Mecca, for instance. to Kaaba and the shrine of Kaaba, and it would seem that there were, for instance, some Christians going to the Kaaba shrine to worship God there. Peter Webb has this amazing new article on the pre-Islamic Hajj, and on the basis of poetical evidence that he has gathered, we might understand or suggest that also the rituals around the Kaaba shrine or centered on the Kaaba shrine were also to a large degree monotheists. So in the poetical sort of references to Mecca that or the Kaaba shrine that he has collected in the article, the poems always mention Allah or Arab, the Lord or God, as being the deity that is worshipped during the pilgrimage rituals around the Kaaba shrine, even before Islam. And this is, of course, quite different from what we see in sort of Arabic historiographical tradition, which in a narrative that is quite often cited. In one narrative, it is said that there was 360 idols around the Kaaba. So this, should in all likelihood be rejected or at least problematized on the basis of poetry, and also the sort of the wider context of Arabian epigraphic record.
Yeah, it's very interesting how the epigraphic corpus, what we're starting to find in them, has given validity or new life to looking at the poetic corpus and seeing what it can tell us about pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabia. In terms of Muslim era sources, you mentioned that most scholars believe the early Arabic historical tradition isn't contemporary with pre-Islamic events, the Prophet Muhammad or the earliest caliphs. How do you use it as a reliable historical source? What challenges do these sources present? And how can they be overcome to better reconstruct pre-Islamic Arabia and early Islam? Because that's one thing that, in terms of Muslims who engage with this work, should we totally discard the early Arabic historical tradition because it's not contemporary, or is there a way that we can also still use it considering the facts I just mentioned?
Yeah. Yeah, in this book, I really tried to, or wanted to, concentrate on the contemporary material, which like I mentioned, I think there's quite a bit at the moment that can be used to, offer some reconstructions of history, and I don't use that much sort of Arabic historical tradition. I use it to study some episodes and mention that there are some aspects in the tradition that seem to align quite well, quite nicely actually, with what we know, or what I suggest that we know from the more contemporary material. While I think that it's more or less proven that Arabic historical tradition is not contemporary, I still think that it's a valuable source, and especially when used in tandem with more contemporary evidence, people could try to offer new understandings, new readings of the biography of the Prophet, for instance, or say the Muslim conquest that followed his life. So I think it's valuable. What has lacked so far, I think, before this new epigraphic record came to light, was sort of like material that we can control or sort of, I don't know, gauge the Arabic historical tradition with. That is to say that Arabic historical tradition, first, it's very rich and diverse set of evidence. I mean, there's a lot of usually diverging or sometimes diverging traditions and narratives about what was going on in pre-Islamic Arabia. Before it was somewhat up to the scholar's own judgment to say what seemed to be more valuable, more historical in that tradition. And, just use the tradition itself to sort of navigate it and try to offer some reconstructions of, for instance, earlier layers of the tradition, or perhaps historical reality that it was describing. But now when we have more and more epigraphic record, and of course people have been publishing, for instance, new papyri from Egypt, sort of this contemporary, often documentary, and sometimes grassroots evidence that from sort of the point of view of a historian is more valuable, then we can probably say that those narratives in the Arabic historical tradition that align better with the contemporary evidence, they have more claim to authenticity. They're more valuable as proof for something than maybe other parts of the tradition. So that I think is something that should be taken into account always if you're reading these narratives from sort of like a historical perspective. Of course, they are valuable for a number of different things. I mean, to study and understand the development of Muslim theology, for instance, various things, or the prophetical traditions and the burgeoning of that corpus. But if one's interest is to try and find, for instance, what was going on in Mecca in the 7th century, early 7th century, before the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, then probably those parts of the tradition that align better with the epigraphic record are something that we should, look at more closely. So that I think there's a lot of promise from sort of, once again, talking from a historian's perspective, a lot of promise in trying to understand the Arabic historical tradition from this sort of perspective, trying to use it in tandem with more contemporary evidence, and then see what follows from that. And to emphasize that while I don't think it's contemporary evidence, I don't think it's unimportant evidence or anything like that. In this book, I didn't really want to focus so much on this because I wanted to really prioritize the contemporary evidence. But for instance, in the article that I have been writing, the religious groups of Mecca and Medina, in that article, for instance, I also adduce evidence from Arabic historical tradition. For instance, the historian Al-Yaqubi, who lived in the late 9th century, actually, when he maps the religious phenomena of pre-Islamic Arabia, he sort of says that most of the Arabian Peninsula had become Christian by the time the Prophet Muhammad was born. He first starts with a very long narrative, tens of pages of different descriptions of supposed, at least, idol worship in Arabian Peninsula. But then in a very short space of maybe one page, he says that, yeah, and by the way, these tribes had become Christian, and these tribes had become Jewish. And the tribes that he lists is actually, I would, suggest is the majority of the Arabians at the time. So there's definitely valuable information in Arabic historical tradition, but it should be viewed in light of more contemporary evidences, I think.
Yeah, definitely. The feel I got from your book is that it puts the first things first in terms of what evidence we should look at first to try to understand the religious milieu of pre-Islamic Arabia, Arabia on the eve of Islam and shortly after. But can the Arabic historical tradition produced by classical Muslim scholars tell us anything useful about the identity struggles and negotiation at play in the 7th and 8th centuries?
I think yes. with some caveats. I mean, once again, most of the Arabic historical tradition, at least according to my reading, suggests that the change from something else than Islam to Islam was very quick.
Mm.
And that something else is usually polytheism. But there are these strands of Arabic historical tradition, these narratives that actually emphasize that there were quite a lot of Jews and Christians around. I mean, descriptions of Medina, even though they quite often emphasize the polytheist nature of the inhabitants of the town, they sometimes too mention, somewhat in passing perhaps, that many of the tribes were Jews. And that seems to be the case on the basis of the constitution of Medina, for instance. Also, even though the inhabitants of Mecca are portrayed as I mean, majority polytheists, definitely in Arabic historical tradition. Once again, there are these narratives that stick out. There are these narratives about Warqa ibn Nawfal, the Prophet Muhammad's wives, Khadija's cousin, who is said to have been Christian. Sorry?
Another figure named Zayd. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but there was another guy who was styled as a monotheist in the time of Muhammad that, you know, kind of gives you a glimpse of what seems like a historical memory of monotheists that existed in the region.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, usually these, even if you collect all the mentions of supposed Christians in Arabic historical tradition, it's only a few names, but that even those few names seem to suggest that there was this memory of quite a few Jews and Christians around. And perhaps I would say that since the Christian affiliation of many of these figures, including Warqa ibn Nawfal, aligns very well with epigraphic record, then perhaps from sort of historical point of view, these people were really Christian. We could suggest at least that in sort of like a, while doing sort of hardcore historical academic work. And not only that these figures really existed, which I take for granted for many of these figures around Prophet Muhammad, but also that that their religious affiliation, for instance, as Jewish or Christian, should be you know, accepted, acknowledged, and also to that effect, if we have diverging traditions saying that a person was a Christian, and then we have a conflicting report on the person saying that no, he was really not a Christian, he was, you know, a Hanif, a sort of like monotheist without clear religious affiliation, or that he was actually a polytheist, then I think we should prioritize those traditions that claim that some person was Jewish or Christian, because that quite neatly aligns with the epigraphic record, which suggests that Jews and Christians were, you know, between them, they were the majority in at least most parts of Arabia. So there are these, sometimes we might call this minority reports, for instance, in Arabic historical tradition that seem to me at least to be more credible as historical sources than some other narratives. And also when it comes to the change, the religious change in Islamic times during the life of the Prophet Muhammad and later, even though the sort of dominant view in Arabic historical tradition is that all Arabian tribes became Muslim very soon after the Prophet's death or during his life even. I think I quote one tradition from Al-Waqidi saying that all Arabs became Muslim. Aslamat al-Arab kulluha. All Arabs became Muslim during the last years of the Prophet's life. And that's sort of the dominant view in the sources. But then there are also these narratives, sort of perhaps in the minority, that mention that actually there was a continuing Jewish and Christian presence in the Arabian Peninsula for quite some time. So once again, Arabic historical tradition, very rich, also very conflicting, self-conflicting sometimes. So, and perhaps with the help of contemporary material, we might be able to say which parts of the tradition are more credible from a historian's point of view.
Obviously, your work principally focuses on religious identity, but do any of the sources at our disposal provide an accurate picture of how pre-Islamic Arabians perceive their own ethnic and linguistic identity?
Yeah, there has been quite a bit of scholarly work of late on the ethnic identity and sort of historical linguistics of Arabian Peninsula before Islam, and especially thanks to Peter Webb's work, his book called Imagining the Arabs, it has become more and more common to question the idea of sort of like how would you say, like ancient Arab identity or sort of homogeneous Arab identity or Arab group that was inhabiting Arabian Peninsula. And nowadays it's more and more common to acknowledge that Arabians on the eve of Islam, and later of course as well, they were actually quite multicultural, multi-ethnic, and there were a variety of languages spoken and also written in Arabian Peninsula. For instance, in the south, in ancient Yemen, that is to say modern Yemen and parts of southern Saudi Arabia, there it would seem to me at least the majority of the inhabitants there spoke South Arabian languages rather than Arabic, which is a North Arabian language. And they did not self-identify as Arab, even though later in Islamic times, Yemenis actually become sort of the real Arabs in the ethnic discourse in Islamic times. And this is a really interesting phenomenon that happens at some point. They are the Al-Arab al-Ariba in Arabic tradition, the real Arabic-speaking Arabs, whereas before Islam, actually, it would seem that they were majority non-Arabic speaking. So there's quite a bit of linguistic diversity in Arabian Peninsula on the eve of Islam, it would seem, on the basis of evidence that is available at the moment. Also, this question of ethnic identity, which of course ethnic identity is something that has to do with self-identification, but also how others see you. And it's true that there are references to Arabs already in ancient Mesopotamia, like 1000 BCE or thereabouts. And of course, today, still we have a group that identifies as Arab. Now the question is, has this word always meant the same? Has it always meant as a speaker of Arabic? Are there other perhaps cultural facets that were attached to that identification or social category? And it would seem, for instance, that in late antiquity, there were quite a few people who called themselves Arab, but we don't actually have any evidence that they spoke Arabic. We have these, for instance, this Greek, some letters and inscriptions in Greek where somebody calls themselves in Greek as Arab. So it's difficult to say whether or not Arab identity has always meant the same, probably not. And as regards the sort of the time period in question and the life of the Prophet Muhammad, how many inhabitants of Arabia actually self-identified as Arab, and did it always mean that a person was a speaker of Arabic?
Tied to a certain geographical location.
Yeah, right.
Because from what I understand of people who identified as Arabs in late antiquity, it was a pretty wide expanse. And not only that, they also had various different cultural attachments that varied. So it really calls into question what did it mean to be Arab in Arab pre-Islam, which is again extremely fascinating.
Yeah, I think it should be emphasized that, of course, the Quran calls itself Quran Arabi, Arabic Quran. Whether some sense of ethnic sort of identification is at play there, I don't know, but it should be emphasized that, of course, the Quran self-identifies as an Arabic revelation. And here I think that the word Arabic actually means Arabic as we understand it nowadays. But to what extent did the Prophet Muhammad, for instance, identify as an Arab? I don't know. We don't have any good evidence for or against that.
Returning back a little bit to sort of religious groupings and sort of deconflating them a little bit, what can the epigraphic data and the Arabic poetry tell us specifically about the presence of Jewish groups in late ancient Arabia and the Hijaz specifically?
Yeah. So the Jewish presence in North Arabia, if we'll, based on epigraphic record in particular, seems to have started in the 1st century BCE or thereabouts. Quite often, the presence of Arabian Jews is linked in scholarship to the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, which happened in 70 Common Era. But the epigraphic record is earlier than that. So there definitely were Jews in Northern Arabia before the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Of course, it's possible that the destruction caused more Jews to migrate south to Arabian Peninsula, but at least it should be acknowledged that the presence of them is earlier than that. What sort of Jews are we talking about? Some were probably migrants that came from Palestine and other parts of the Near East, but there also seems to have been a phenomenon of Arabians to convert to Judaism. So at least in the south, we can say that that was the case in Yemen, where in the 4th century, it would seem that the large parts of the population became Jewish, probably through conversion rather than migration, and probably also in the north we have at least some examples of that, even though that's difficult to pinpoint. But I would suggest that because there's quite a bit of evidence of Arabic speaking Jews, so of course they could be Jews that had, like, their forefathers had already came there, and because of this they had adopted Arabic as their spoken language. but probably also we have some converts to Judaism in ancient and late ancient North Arabia, and that's certainly the case in the south. The interesting thing is that in the north we have quite a bit of evidence of Jews in northern Hijaz, that region around Taima, Tabuk, and Dedan, Al-Ola nowadays, until 400 or so, or 300 or so, but not so much after that. Now the question is, why is that? Of course, if we look at Muslim era sources and Muslim sources, such as the Constitution of Medina, the Qur'an, and Arabic historical tradition, that evidence quite clearly, I would say, that there was still quite a bit of Jews in Medina in particular, but also other parts of the peninsula in the north, like Khaybar, for instance, a famous sort of like town that in Arabic historical tradition is portrayed at least as majority Jewish. So maybe those inscriptions haven't been found yet, or maybe sort of the epigraphic habit of in those towns or among Arabian Jews just dies out at some point. But there's sort of like this gap of a couple of hundred of years where the epigraphic record is completely silent on the presence of the Jews, and then they sort of pop up again in the Arabic historical tradition and other Muslim sources. So I would suggest, hypothetically, and this can change if new evidence comes to light, and I hope it will, I would suggest that we simply haven't found those inscriptions yet, or the epigraphic habit just for some reasons dies out among North Arabian Jews, but they themselves didn't really dwindle or go anywhere or die out completely, because they're so well established, so very well present in the Islamic sources. So that's my view, at least at the moment. In the south, we have evidence of Jews until the 6th century. Between the 4th and 6th century is the sort of the flourishing of South Arabian Jewish population, and of course that's little by little that Jewish population starts to convert, first actually probably in the 6th century to Christianity, some conversion there to Christianity, and then to Islam. But of course there has been, up to this day, there has been Yemeni Jews living in Yemen. So of course that should be acknowledged as well. But so in the north we have some gaps in the evidence. Maybe also we should look at these, which I have called unclassified monotheist inscriptions, which we have now quite a few from between 400 and 600 Common Era. By unclassified, I mean that they mention, or unclassified monotheist, they mention the one God as Allah or Al-Ilah or Al-Rab, but they do not have any clear other markers of identity which would help us distinguish whether or not they were Jews, Christians, or something else. So maybe among those so-called unclassified monotheist inscriptions, we also have, some of them were written by Jews, perhaps, others by Christians, perhaps, and then we also have a phenomenon of pagan monotheism, Gentile monotheism, which seems to have been present in Arabian Peninsula. But yeah, the epigraphic record at the moment, as regards to Jews, is in the north somewhat problematic in the sense that there's gaps in the evidence, but in the south is sort of like more continuous, and we can see there more clearly what sort of Judaism there was in the south, even though there are definitely issues and questions that cannot be answered at the moment. And yeah, you mentioned poetry, and poetry, of course, we have very few figures among the pre-Islamic Arabic poets that are identified as Jewish in the tradition. But there's certainly one who's very famous, Sama'al ibn Adia, and his poetry I discussed to an extent, and there's definitely religious topics in his poems, in particular one poem which is very heavily religious in its sort of flavor and themes, and you know, to a degree, once again, we can use the Arabic poetical corpus to make sort of more full our understanding of Arabian Peninsula on the eve of Islam.
So, what concepts and ideas present in the Jewish, I believe, Himyarite inscriptions are produced in the Quran?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So, Himyarite or Sabaic inscriptions stemming from South Arabia. There's at the moment a corpus of around 150 inscriptions. Wow. Belonging to this period between the 4th century and the 6th. And on the basis of that corpus, it's definitely all monotheist, and there are some references to Judaism, which to me to suggest that perhaps even more generally the South Arabian epigraphic monotheist corpus is Jewish, though we should of course acknowledge that there were probably others as well living in Yemen who might have identified otherwise. And there are some ideas, concepts that appear in the Sabaic inscriptions that then are echoed in the Quran. The God, the one God in Sabaic is called Rahmanan, which in Arabic then becomes Ar-Rahman.
The definite article is at the end for South Arabian versus Arabic, where the definite article is in the beginning.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So that specific appellation to designate God is definitely one important feature. Of course, in Sabaic, it's much more dominant. It's, I mean, sometimes Il or Ilan appears for God in Sabaic, but mostly it's Rahmanan that appears in these inscriptions. Of course, in the Quran, Rahman is not the primary appellation for God. Allah is. So Rahman is sort of echoed in the Quran, but doesn't sort of become the primary designation for God in the Quran. But you know that's definitely important, and people have suggested, and I think at least some of them are probably correct, that there are quite a bit of loan words in Arabic of the time that then are, of course, sort of reproduced, or you can find in the Quran as well, which come from Sabaic, you know, Amen, these sort of words. But these are quite, of course, I don't know, common in various Semitic languages, so it's very difficult to say from which language they might have been borrowed to Arabic before Islam. Sabaic is definitely an option, but forms of Aramaic can also come into question.
Many scholars agree that the basic Quranic beliefs, such as monotheism and religious laws, such as dietary and purity regulations, would cohere with what most late antique Jews would have espoused. However, they often envision a more marked break between the Quranic religious worldview of Christian beliefs, thus making it difficult for local Christians to join the Prophet's movement. You argue, based on the information we have on late antique Christianity, that was not necessarily the case. Can you explain why?
Yeah, and here I really make use of sort of new insights in the New Testament scholarship on early Christianity and also late ancient Christianity, especially like Paolo Fredriksson has called it a Protestant myth that Christianity was law-free, either from the get-go or at in late antiquity, later. So if you look at ancient and late ancient evidence that is available, and it should be, of course, acknowledged that this evidence does not really come from Arabia, but north of Arabia. But Christian literature written in antiquity and late antiquity suggests that there were quite a few Christians who thought that law, nomos in Greek, or namusa in Syriac, was important, perhaps even central to their religious tradition, their religious practices. So there were various forms of dietary restrictions that some Christian groups followed, it would seem, some purity regulations that some Christian groups followed, and even if we exclude those, there are, Syriac and other texts on inheritance law that are important in various Christian groups. We have, in Syriac sources, we have even designations of this understanding of Christian law as the law of Messiah, the law of the Christ. So clearly, to some, maybe minority, Christian groups, the understanding that Christianity had some sort of law, however understood, clearly that was quite important to some groups. Now, like I said, none of this evidence actually comes from Arabia, but it's possible to suggest at least that perhaps in Arabia as well, there were Christians who deemed law important to their religious practice, once again, however understood, and sort of Quranic dietary and purity rules. It has been suggested by Holger Celentin, for instance, were actually something that Christians might have understood as familiar, and definitely not something that was completely alien to them, something that they thought that disagreed with their religious beliefs and practices completely. So that's something that I suggest. But once again, hopefully at some point we have inscriptions by pre-Islamic Arabic-speaking Christians that somehow address this issue, and that will then maybe shed new light on this scholarly debate.
And what kind of Christology can we find evidenced in pre-Islamic inscriptions in Arabia, like those of Abraham, for example?
Yeah. And here in this part of the book, I think chapter 6, I sort of suggest that I'm building on other scholars' work, that there probably were quite a few Christians who did not think that sort of official doctrines such as the triune God were central to their faith. And this is similar that we find nowadays among Christians. I mean, especially the idea of Trinitarianism is very difficult. It's very theological. And many people, and we find this in many polls, I cite some of them from the US and Finland in the book, where modern Christians in these countries say that, well, in fact, these doctrines are not really important to me. I don't really understand it. I don't even believe in them. Many people say that, even though from sort of official point of view, they are key and they are sort of central, that you know, the two natures of Jesus and the Trinity. So on the basis of that idea, I suggest that that we can interpret some Quranic passages that seem to suggest that Christians are A, believers, B, they are part of the group of the followers of Muhammad. And then on the other hand, those Quranic references to or Quranic polemics against Trinity, for instance, or the idea that Jesus was God in flesh. So maybe those Christians who joined the Prophet Muhammad's movement might not have actually viewed the Quranic revelations, those Quranic passages that criticize Trinity, so problematic actually, because maybe they did not think that those doctrines were so central to their faith. And indeed, I suggest that that the Sabaic inscriptions set up by King Abraha, who ruled in the 6th century in Yemen. He was a Christian king or ruler who you know, sponsored Christianity, for instance, and launched raids to Central Arabia, Northern Arabia. And of course, in Arabic historical tradition, the famous narrative says that Abraha also invaded or tried to invade Mecca, but his elephant, that was part of his, you know, war troop, the elephant did not want to enter Mecca because the elephant apparently is the idea of the narrative deemed Mecca sacred, so didn't want to go there. Now we don't have any evidence in the epigraphic records that Abraham tried to conquer Mecca, but we actually have an inscription that says that he launched raids to Medina, so Yathrib in the inscription. So it's possible that he passed or even perhaps tried to conquer Mecca, but we don't have any evidence of that yet. But the inscriptions of Abraha are important because some of them, if I remember correctly, there's only 4 inscriptions that were commissioned by Abraha that are known to date. And if I remember correctly, 2 of them have some sort of Christological discourse in them. And what is interesting in those 2 inscriptions is that they mention God and his Messiah, not sort of identifying Jesus as a figure with 2 natures, as a divine nature and human nature, but somehow suggesting perhaps that God is higher in hierarchy than Jesus is, according to that inscription. So and that is probably the only evidence that we have from Arabia of, you know, Christological discussions and debates, but it too seems to suggest that there was a diversity of opinions, perhaps, that were acceptable by late antique Arabian Christians as regards Christology.
And what references to Christians and Christianity do we find in pre-Islamic poetry? Do we have any specific poems from Christian poets?
Yeah, we certainly have. We don't have a lot of references to Christianity in pre-Islamic poetry. And now the question is why that is, if we accept my reconstruction of Christianity as having had a very important presence in many, if not most, parts of Arabia. So first, if we start with the sort of Christian poets that we know from the tradition or from their names that they were in all likelihood Christian, there are some poems in the famous Al-Mufaddaliyat poetical collection by two figures called Abdul Masih, the servant of Christ. Clearly a Christian name, I would say. Clearly a Christian name. If you look at those two, I think it's only two poems by these two figures, so one each. If you look at those poems, they don't have any religious flavor at all. So, and of course that is true to the vast majority of pre-Islamic Arabic poetical corpus, actually, that religious topics are not very common. They only surface in passing. So I would suggest that it was just not very common in sort of the poetical, I don't know, discourse or culture to address religious topics, even though these people might have been really religious in their, private lives, private and public lives. But in the poetry, they discuss other themes such as hunting or bravery or some other thing. Then we have some poems by people who are known in the tradition to have been Christian, such as Ali ibn Zayd from the Lakhmid court in Hira, where he spent, according to the tradition, most of his life. And there's questions about the authenticity of his corpus. I wouldn't say that we should reject his poetical corpus. Other scholars have been more skeptical, perhaps, towards his poetry, but I didn't see any aspects in it that would make me sort of more doubtful as regards Adi's poems than other people's other poets' poetry. So I think Adi ibn Zayd, definitely a Christian person. Some of his poetry is probably authentic. Then we have figures who are not known as Christian in the tradition, such as An-Nabigha al-Thubyani, a 6th century poet who was very famous and active in the Ghassanid court in Syria. Now, the Ghassanids had been Christians for quite some time. An-Nabigha was, at least for some time, their main poet, extolling them. Even though the Islamic era tradition does not sort of recognize or remember An-Nabigha as a Christian, I think it's highly likely that he actually was Christian on the basis of just the context and all that. If he were a pagan and he came to the Ghassanid court, very Christian sort of dynasty who's sponsored Christianity, built Christian churches and monasteries in the region, probably the first thing that the Ghassanis would have told An-Nabigha is, you should get baptized if he wasn't Christian already. But I would suggest that we have quite a bit of Christian poets, even though many of them are not necessarily remembered as Christian. And then I would also say that, for instance, Adi ibn Zayd's corpus should be treated, as authentic, at least to some degree.
obviously the insights that you're able to get from these Christians in these surrounding areas is fascinating, particularly in terms of the possibility of Christians being in the Prophets movement, because one of the main contentions for that would be, oh, they couldn't accept the Christology in the Quran to be able to do that, or they wouldn't be able to sort of follow the same, they didn't have the same concept of law. But your work has really challenged that, which is really fascinating. One thing that obviously, as you mentioned, Shoemaker is sort of focused on is the idea that we don't have much evidence of a Christian and Jewish presence specifically in Mecca or Medina prior to the emergence of Islam. How do you overcome that in your research?
Yeah, that's definitely a a gap in the evidence that we should acknowledge, and scholars can read it in various ways, as Shoemaker does, as signaling that Mecca and Medina were Christ barren, as he described the situation. But like I mentioned, there are new monotheist inscriptions from between Taif and Mecca, which seem to suggest that at least some monotheists were around. Of course, we don't necessarily know whether or not these people were Christian, even though although we should actually note that in the new article published in Journal of Near Eastern Studies by Ahmed Al-Jalad and Hatem Sidki, where they published two of these new inscriptions from between Taif and Mecca. The one of the inscription actually seems to have been written by a figure who is later remembered as having been a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, but his father, Abd Amr, Abu Amr, Abd Amr, if I remember correctly, is remembered in the sources as having been Christian, a Medinan Christian. He's called a Rahib, or the monk, sort of like a by name, probably doesn't, or possibly doesn't signal that he was really a monk, but could have been just a sort of like a by name, a nickname that he was given. So we have these memories in the Islamic tradition of some Christians in Mecca and Medina, and we definitely have quite a bit of evidence, at least narratives, of Medinan Jews in the Muslim historical tradition. So I think if you take those into account, also the poetical corpus, on the basis of that, we can suggest, even though it's impossible to gauge any numbers, that Mecca and Medina also had Christian and Jewish individuals living there. How well developed those communities were, or well established, what sort of institutes they had, we don't know at the moment so well, but in particular when it comes to Medina, the Jewish population seems to have been very sizable in this, and the Islamic tradition mentions, for instance, that there was this Jewish educational institute there. So I think those reports are really credible, and I definitely deem them as authentic historical memory.
And I believe Zayd ibn Thabit was a student at the Jewish school that was in Medina.
Yeah, what it said.
Yeah, which leads to another interesting group. Your concept of Gentile monotheist is fascinating and brings to mind the Hunafa, which is another very interesting group we find in the Arabic historical tradition. They were pre-Islamic Arabian monotheists who, while not strictly adhering to Christian or Judaism, had beliefs aligning with those faiths. Could this reflect a cultural memory of a group considered the Hanpa, if I'm saying that correct, in Syriac, known to be seen as heathens by their Christian counterparts due to their non-conversions? And how did the Quran repurpose this notion by associating Abraham with the term Hanif, portraying him neither Christian nor Jew, but obviously a monotheist.
Yeah. I definitely think that the group of Hunafa reflects a cultural memory of a form of monotheism in pre-Islamic Arabia, and so the etymology that is quite widely accepted, I definitely accept it as well, is that the Arabic Hanif comes from the Syriac Hanpa, meaning pagan, heathen, Gentile. Various translations are being used. And in Syriac text, that's a pejorative term. It doesn't appear, well, in some translations of the New Testament, it also appears in the positive sense of sort of like pagan believers or believers in Christ of pagan background. But most of the occurrences are definitely negative. Now, of course, in the Quran, Hanif is all the Hanif occurrences in the Quran are positive, definitely positive. And so there seems to have been sort of reinterpretation of that term of and of course there are these like I mentioned, New Testament translations into Syriac where Hanpa are those believers actually who are just of pagan background, of Gentile background. So probably the Quran is to an extent echoing those Syriac Christian discourses regarding the Hanpa, that they could be actually believers, monotheists, even among the group of pagans. And then on the basis of these Quranic passages and some memories of various pagan monotheists living in Arabia before Islam, there then arises this sort of tradition of the Hunafa as a sort of a group of people who rejected the polytheism of their day and went usually away somewhere from their community to practice the worship of the one God. Now, the problem with that is that in the Arabic historical tradition, they are always painted as the exception, that most of the people were polytheists, and then there were these few Hunafa who rejected the polytheism and idolatry of the day and worshipped the one God. I think the situation was quite different. So there were probably a monotheist majority in most or all parts of the peninsula, consisting of not only Jews and Christians, but also pagan monotheists. And pagan monotheism is a concept used in scholarship to describe various groups and individuals in late antiquity and especially in Near East. It would seem that there was this phenomena in the 4th, 5th, 6th century that people, even though they did not formally convert to Judaism and Christianity, they still accepted, to some degree at least, the idea of there being only one God. And they probably took part in maybe some ceremonies or festivals at the local synagogue or the church, but they did not formally convert to that religion. And people have been suggesting, on the basis of the Quran and Arabic poetry, and in particular, I mean Patricia Krone and Nikolai Sinai, that this phenomenon of pagan monotheism was also present in Arabia. And I think that's a very plausible interpretation of the evidence.
I believe so too. And in your view, does Islamic Arab does Islamic era Arabic historiography like Hisham ibn al-Kalbi, his Kitab al-Asnam, seek to erase the memory of a Judeo-Christian and otherwise monotheist Arabia?
Yeah, I mean, Hisham ibn al-Kalbi is a good example of a type of Arabic historical tradition that really doesn't mention almost any, I think, Jews or Christians as having lived in Arabian Peninsula. There are, of course, other works. I think even Hisham's Asiratul Nabawiyya, or the prophetical biography, acknowledges much more the presence of Jews and Christians in the region, and I think that's much more in line with what the epigraphic record tells us. But Hisham ibn al-Kalbi is a prime example of a form of Arabic historiography that also existed on side with the other one that acknowledged more the presence of Jews and Christians. And I would just suggest that the work of Hisham ibn Kalbi and similar works really try to erase the memory of Judeo-Christian presence to emphasize the revolutionary nature of the mission of the Prophet Muhammad and the coming of Islam. So in order that to be a complete break with the past, he and others writing like him in the same tradition wanted to, and quite successfully really try to erase that memory and really emphasize the presence of polytheists in the region. And like I mentioned, I don't say that there were no polytheists around. I just think that they were in the minority. So Hisham's writing only describes one part of Arabian religious life, and probably also invents out of whole cloth a lot of various you know, idols that existed in different towns, for instance, or religious practices that according to him existed in Arabian Peninsula, but probably did not.
So, in your view, since there are like you just explained, that it was sort of small at the time of the Prophet, by the time of the Prophet, there were only maybe small pockets of polytheists in the region. In your view, who are the mushrikun and the kuffar that the Quran is mainly addressed to, given what you've mapped in terms of the transition from polytheism to monotheism that we have both in the epigraphic record and in pre-Islamic poetry?
Yeah. I'm really happy that we get a chance to ask this question because I've had it on my mind for such a long time since reading Patricia Crona's Quranic Pagans and Related Matters. And after reading some of the chapters in that, it had me thinking like, man, who are the mushrikun? I had to agree with her, like they have to be the most unusual pagans that I've ever come across. Considering how they're described in the Quran, where you can almost see that they, have certain conceptions of monotheism, but then the Quran uses this term mushrikun in order to kind of take them away from that. And so, yeah, it's such a mind-boggling term, and what the Quran kind of means when it uses it against the opponents of the Prophet.
Right. Yeah, that's a good and tricky question, definitely. I would perhaps start by noting that they were probably not one group in the sense that they were diverse individuals that had various views vis-a-vis the one God or many gods as they saw it. So probably in a sense, the group or category of mushrikun is a sort of rhetorical creation in the sense that many views that the Quran disagrees with are sort of put in the same basket, if I can put it that way. The mushrikun appear in the Quran circa 100 times. You can contrast that to the believers, mu'minun, who appear almost 1,000 times. So clearly the mushrikun are not sort of the dominant group in the audience, or however you want to envision it, in the audience of the Prophet Muhammad. Also, some mushrikun references in the Quran are definitely historical. So they discuss historical communities, such as the group Thamud, to whom the Prophet Saleh is sent, Abraham's contemporaries, Moses' contemporaries. So there are quite a few of these mushrikun references in the Quran are actually in sort of like historical plane, or amidst historical narratives, not sort of contemporaries of the Prophet Muhammad. Of course, some of them are described as having been the contemporaries of the Prophet Muhammad, and here definitely it would seem that variety of beliefs, religious beliefs that are not in line with the Quranic understanding of monotheism are labeled shirk. So at least in one verse, also Christian belief in Jesus's two natures is described as shirk. So clearly there are variety of these views that the Quran describes as being something that should be rejected and are labeled as shirk, or as associating other beings to God. So so that's one thing. The other thing is what Patricia Krone, who you mentioned, has suggested, that there was this development in late antiquity, and Nikolai Sinai has sort of studied the same phenomenon on the basis of the on the poetical evidence, that the so-called pagans, though they had started to accept and adopt some of the ideas of monotheism, they were not, completely monotheist, and they still held some of these supernatural beings as existing, and perhaps as being angelic beings of some sort who intercede between a human being and God, Allah. So they believe in Allah in the sense that he was the creator God, but then there were these other sorts of supernatural beings below him, and this would characterize some of the mushrikun, perhaps. Of course, the problem with that is, or maybe it's not a problem, but just a gap at the moment, is that we don't have any epigraphic record, as far as I know, for that sort of development. So that still needs to be discovered if it exists. So when more evidence comes to light, maybe we can understand this better. It is certainly true that the sort of the pagan gods that the Quran mentions, Allat, Al-Uzza, Manat, they are real Arabian, divinities that are, in the sense that they exist in the epigraphic record up to 400 Common Era or thereabouts. So they really are. They are not just complete imagination that some people, at least in some point in history, believed in these gods. Of course, even these Allah, Al-Uzza, Manat, they only appear once, I think, in the Quran. So if sort of polytheistic beliefs were very common among the audience or the opponents of the Prophet Muhammad, then perhaps the Quran would mention these figures' names more often, I suppose.
In terms of other sort of key words pertaining to religious identity in the Quran, three that you focus on in particular are Mumin, Ummi, and Hanif. What can those terms tell us about how the Quran fits into a multi-religious West Arabian context that was composed mainly of Gentile monotheists, Jews, and Christians?
Yeah, very, very good question. I mean, Hanif, we have already covered to a degree. Ummi seems to have been or functioned as more or less like a synonym to Hanif, denoting someone of pagan background. And in the Quran, in contrast to Hanif, which is always positive, Ummi also appears in the negative or neutral, in the sense that sometimes the people who are not necessarily followers of the Prophet Muhammad are also called Ummiyun. So it's not completely the same as Hanif. Of course, the Prophet Muhammad is called An-Nabi al-Ummi. Once again, I would understand this as a prophet that arises from sort of like a pagan background. So and similarly to Hanif, in the sense that Hanif is connected quite often to Abraham in the Quran, and Abraham is sort of like a figure, an exemplary figure that the Prophet Muhammad is compared to quite often in the Quran. I would suggest that all of these words were sort of pre-existing words in Arabic of that era. Mu'min seems to derive from Ethiopic me'emen, even though it might also an alternative derivation would be from Syriac. But in any way, it would seem to come from a Christian context, and we indeed have Ali ibn Zayd's poetry mentioning, I think, himself as a mu'min. So definitely a word, a bit mu'min translated as believer, word that existed and was current in Arabia at the time. So if and when the Quran uses those words, and especially mu'minun, it seems that the Quran is continuing a usage that at least the Christians, probably the Jews as well, were using to designate themselves. It was a term that had positive connotations completely. It meant to believe in one God, but also probably meant, in various usages, some sort of religious affiliation as well to a religious community. But when, as I suggest, the Quran only or mostly seems to use mu'minun to describe the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, that to me indicates, or at least suggests, that the Quran is not creating a clear difference vis-a-vis Jews and Christians, but is actually using language that is inviting Jews and Christians and possible others to join the Prophet's movement. That's how I at least understand it.
We've had a lot of discussions on this channel about the pre-Islamic existence of the idea that the Quraysh belonged to the lineage of Abraham through Ismail, and the association of this with the Kaaba. What is your view on whether or not this was a Quranic innovation based on the evidence you have reviewed?
Yeah, I really think that this notion of Abrahamic descent obtained already before Islam, and not only in the case of Quraysh. There were Arabs or Arabians more generally who thought themselves as belonging to the line of Abraham through Ishmael. I really think that this is the case. Of course, the pre-Islamic evidence is, as far as I know, at the moment, it's only written by outsiders who posit this view. So it's difficult to say if many Arabians actually espouse the view themselves, but I would think that was the case. And indeed, the Quran really speaks to that same theme and understands the Prophet Muhammad's followers as descending, in some sense at least, from Abraham. And you know, in key passages of the Quran, Abraham with his son are described as building the Kaaba shrine or laying the foundation of the Kaaba shrine. And then they pray that may God send a prophet later in time, that is the Prophet Muhammad, from among the sort of Gentile or pagan populace of that area. So in many different senses, both in sort of more actual descent, but also sort of like I don't know, symbolic and on the plane of narrative, it would seem that this linkage between Abraham and Muhammad and his community is quite important aspect in the Quran. So that definitely seems to be the case. And of course, in the biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, his sort of lineage is always goes to Abraham and from there onwards, of course, all the way to Adam. But that's how it's presented. So the connection between Abraham and Muhammad is quite important. It seems both in the Quran and then the later Muslims who of course had you know, knew the Quran very well and considered those ideas important to them. And like I mentioned, this idea to some degree at least seem to have been existing in pre-Islamic times as well.
You know, I do wonder, considering your research and how it appears that more Arab tribes are starting to become Christian in late antiquity or as we get closer to the time of Islam. I wonder if this idea of Ismail descent was starting to be forgotten, considering that they were becoming more and more Christian. And I know within at least Christianity today, Ismail isn't seen as anyone a part of the Abrahamic inheritance. So, you know, I just wonder if that's one of the reasons why the Quran wanted to bring that identity, at least not to the forefront, but back to the forefront.
Yeah. That's definitely possible. And in my reading of the Quran, at least, it seems that it is in particular in the context of sort of pagan monotheism or you know, that part of the movement of the believers who were coming from the pagan background, that this idea of Abraham, connection to Abraham, is invoked in that sort of sense. And that also includes, I would say, the Prophet Muhammad, who the Quran makes quite clear is not from Jewish or Christian background, but was coming from other background, religious background.
And like Shoemaker, the eschatological, I always have a hard time with that word, aspect of the Quran is at the forefront of your interpretation of the Prophet's mission. However, despite agreeing on the same methodological premises, you and Shoemaker arrive at very different interpretations of what this eschatology entailed. Why do you think that is?
Yeah. So, well, briefly, I mean, I see, especially in the Meccan, and this is, of course, more or less the consensus in the field, that especially in the Meccan surahs, the sort of the eschatological discourse is very, very dominant. And then in Medinan passages, this is somewhat tuned down, perhaps one might say, even though it exists in some passages. So I really think that is part of the message of the Prophet Muhammad, in particular in the Meccan era and in the Meccan surahs. So I agree with Shoemaker there, and other scholars who have suggested the same. Stephen Shoemaker, on the other hand, sees this eschatological viewpoint as linked to the fact that the Muslims, after the Prophet Muhammad, conquered a lot of regions in the Near East. Of course, Stephen Shoemaker actually thinks that the Prophet Muhammad, or suggests that the Prophet Muhammad was alive when early Muslims conquered Jerusalem. This is the old idea suggested by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook in Hagerism in 1970s. The evidence for that, in my opinion, is very slight. And also, I think there's very little evidence of this sort of conquest eschatological view in the Quran. I don't see any of that, like the coming of the Asa, the final moment, hour, is I never see it. I've never seen it in the Quran connected to some sort of conquest or battle. It's just not there. So I really don't follow Stephen Shoemaker's suggestions as regards the conquest. It is true, though, that later Muslims, and we know this from sort of Arabic apocalyptic literature, some later Muslims at least viewed the conquests, for instance, the conquest of Istanbul, Constantinople, which they were not able to do. Many other parts, of course, they conquered. Some Muslim scholars, at least, and probably reflecting more common sort of discourse at the time, saw these conquests as being tied to eschatology. But when you look at the more contemporary evidence, it's just not there. And in epigraphic record, I don't see any of that. In the Islamic era Arabic inscriptions, I haven't seen any inscriptions that would link the conquest with eschatology, even though we do have inscriptions that address eschatological hopes on the one hand, and on the other, inscriptions that mention battle and conquest. But they're not linked.
Your interpretation of the term deen also differs maybe from other scholars in the field a little bit, because we have had close analysis of it from people like Zitsu and Gudazi. But can you explain a little bit about how you interpret the term differently, and specifically how it connects to other Quranic concepts like milieu and Islam for you?
Yeah, thanks. Mose Godarzi, who has written fantastic articles on this issue, and I agree on the idea that deen in the Quran doesn't mean a religion, but our interpretations differ somewhat, or quite a bit actually, as regards how to understand it then if it's not a religion. So I sort of suggest that in the book that the meanings of judgment and law are quite, or actually the dominant ones in the Quran, in Quranic Arabic, and law has to be understood here as a very broad category of including also ethical reflections, and also, diet and purity and these issues, which are understood as being nowadays as part of Sharia. So I understand deen, the Quranic Arabic deen, as being somewhat similar, or very similar actually, to how Sharia is understood as a very broad category of various things. So that should be kept in mind. I do agree that Godarzi, and especially, I was writing this book, and many of Godarzi's articles hadn't, come available yet. And probably I would write a little bit differently nowadays. And in some passages of the Quran, I think his interpretation of the Quranic deen as meaning service, worship, and servitude work very well, and I would probably include some of those instances. But in some cases, such as the famous 5:3, which is in later Islamic tradition understood as being this ayat ikmaluddin, so the verse of the the perfecting of the religion, right? in that passage in particular, because the verse and verses before it and after it, they address diet and purity. That is to say, things that fall into category of law according to the late antique understanding of law. So especially in 5.3, where it is said that God has selected or preferred, or however you want to translate the word raditu there, al-Islam dinan. I think in that verse and many others as well, it is at least plausible, and in my opinion probable, that deen means as regards law, dinan, as regards law, and al-Islam means obedience. And so I discussed the word al-Islam in the same connection, because the question is, of course, was the group that formed around the Prophet Muhammad, who followed the Prophet Muhammad, were they calling themselves Muslimun, Muslims, were they calling their religion al-Islam or Islam, as of course happened later and does today. I think that al-Islam and Muslimun in all, or at least the vast majority of the cases in the Quran, can be explained as a signifying obedience, those that are obedient toward God, the law, and the Prophet. So, and there are quite a bit of, actually, at least in Meccan surahs, quite a bit of instances where those that have been given the scripture before are designated with this word al-Islam. So it's said that basically we can probably say that the Jews and Christians are also Muslimun in those passages.
So do you think there is anything in the Quran to suggest that it perceives itself as superseding or abrogating previous scriptures?
The short answer would be no. I mean, what the Quran emphasizes is that it sort of authenticates or verifies previous scriptures. The word used there is musaddiq, or saddaqa being the verb to verify or authenticate. So that is the dominant sort of discourse in the Quran vis-a-vis the earlier scriptures, or the scripture al-Kitab, as it's just usually called in the Quran in sort of singular. So short answer, no. Longer answer, there are some passages definitely that say that the reading of the scripture, the interpretation of the scripture has been somehow misunderstood by Jews and Christians. Of course, some of these passages say that misunderstanding is actually pretty bad. It's actually something pretty major. So it's not to suggest that there's no polemics to this way, but how I understand these passages is that they mostly just talk about interpretation of those passages, though it might be acknowledged that interpretation, that question of differences in interpretation is somewhat major in those passages. But many Quranic passages say that the Quran doesn't supersede or abrogate previous scriptures, but actually authenticates them, confirms them. Musaddiq. The Quran is the musaddiq of previous scriptures. And this is very different from how the Quran sees the covenant, al-mithaq, as a concept. And there, I think, various Quranic passages, such as in Surah Al-Ma'idah, the 5th surah of the Quran, say that Jews and Christians have lost the covenant, al-mithaq, with God. And the group following the Prophet Muhammad is the one that has the covenant now. But when it comes to scriptures and the sort of the sacred books of the Jews and Christians, there the polemics is very muted, I would say, in the Quran. It is only in light of and with the help of later tafsir tradition that then that aspect becomes a very dominant feature in Islamic theology, that previous scriptures are categorically somehow corrupt, tahrif being the name of that doctrine.
You noted in your book that the two hijras to Ethiopia, as documented in early Islamic historiography, represent important testimonies to the notion that in the early community, the distinctly Islamic identity was still emerging and communal borders were not fixed. Can you explain exactly how these narratives demonstrate this and what they can tell us about the Prophet's community and the historiographers themselves?
Yeah, and I think these narratives about the hijra to Ethiopia or Abyssinia, al-Habash in Arabic, are really testimony to the fact, or at least my interpretation, that Arabic historical tradition is very valuable and includes, from a historian's point of view, and includes material that is probably authentic, to some degree at least. Of course, everything has to be approached with a critical eye and read with a sort of like with a critical lens. The narratives about the migration to Ethiopia have an astounding number of examples of early Muslims who are thought to have somehow crossed some religious boundaries, in the sense that they have joined the Christians, for instance, and then maybe come back to Islam. Some actually are said to have taken Christianity back to Arabia, to Mecca, when they came back. So there's interesting sort of these interesting narratives that seem to point towards some historical memory of a situation where sort of this distinctly Islamic identity was still emerging, like we discussed, and you mentioned, Teron, in your question. And like I mentioned, I don't think the category of al-Muslimun obtained at this day. I mean, and most, even those scholars who think that and Muslims started to call themselves Muslims during the life of the Prophet usually date this to the Medinan period, not the Meccan period. So even those scholars, and I would place it much later, of course, but even those scholars would probably acknowledge that at this day, during the Meccan period, Muslims did not call themselves Muslims, but Mu'minun. And so, and that really is connected to the idea of this believers movement. The idea of course, is Fred Donner's, where people from various backgrounds joined the Prophet Muhammad's movement without any official conversion to Islam, because that category didn't really exist as Islam, at least. And the narratives about the Ethiopian migration to Ethiopia and back are really these interesting, rich stories about how people, at that time at least, crossed religious boundaries. And I would suggest that its memory of, there having been some Christians in the movement, and some fluidity of these religious boundaries as having existed, at least in the Meccan period, but probably later as well.
You put a lot of weight in your book on the Constitution of Medina. Why do you believe it to be an authentic document that can be traced back to the Prophet?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important source, and I think most historians, the vast majority of historians, if not all, even Stephen Shoemaker, thinks it's authentic. Of course, it's a document, a treaty text that survives only in sort of later quotations of it. It does not survive as parchment or some, discovery of primary evidence that we would have and could read. But it exists in two different forms and some, other quotations of it, but basically two texts reproduce it as a whole, and they have some variance between the two versions. I mean, I think it's an authentic document because it seems to be so well in line with what I see the Quran as articulating as regards to religious identities of the Medinan community. So the Constitution of Medina basically says that they were also Jewish members in the community that were following the Prophet Muhammad. It invokes the authority of the Prophet Muhammad. It gives certain regulations, certain, rights and duties that various groups have, both tribal groups and religious groups. So it really describes the Medinan Jews, or at least part of the Medinan Jews, as being sort of full members, and I would say equal members of the community. And that is very unlike to be a forgery, because you don't see that same sort of characterization of the Medinan community in any, Arabic historical narrative. That doesn't really appear. There are Quranic passages where you can find something similar. So I think if you take into account the sort of Quranic context, I think it's very I think it's very, in all likelihood, it's an authentic document.
And what can the Constitution help us to gain an idea of how large a city Medina was, and what proportion of them were actually Jewish?
Yeah. I mean, the so-called Constitution mentions some 10 tribal groups, and it's of course impossible to give any exact numbers, but if you hypothesize that a tribal group, even though some of these are sub-tribes, but still a tribal group would probably have at least 100 members, individuals in them, and count that all together, that equals 1,000 inhabitants of Medina. And then when you factor in the fact that the Constitution doesn't mention all Medinan tribes, we know at least from Arabic historical tradition that there were also other tribes living in Medina, then it becomes probable, I would say, that we have to count the population of Medina in thousands at least. What proportion of these were Jews? I mean, the interesting thing about the Constitution is that, it mentions these tribes as having Jewish members, and doesn't really even address the issue at all. It just takes it as, as a fact that they have Jewish members. And so that makes, in my interpretation, it's unlikely that these tribes only had like a couple of Jewish individuals among them, but probably, a sizable portion of them were actually Jewish, because that's just a formulation. It just says Yahud Bani something, Yahud, Jews of this and that tribe, and goes on to tell about their rights. I think the Constitution would somehow address the issue of their number if there were only like a couple of them in among these tribes. And one interesting factor, of course, is in the constitution is that in the Arabic historical tradition we have the narratives about the so-called three great Jewish tribes. This is a formulation by modern scholars. I don't think it appears in the pre-modern evidence, but the modern scholars call these the three great Jewish tribes, namely Banu Qurayza, Banu Qainuqa, and Banu Nadir. The constitution doesn't mention them at all. Instead, it mentions these Jewish members as having been among the sub-tribes of Hazraj, and then it also mentions Banil Aus, and there's some dispute in the scholarship how that should be understood, but if that's the whole group, whole tribe of Aus, then it follows from that actually among the so-called Ansar, among the Hazraj and Aus, there was actually quite a few Jews in those tribes at least. And then in addition to the Hazraji Jews and the Ausi Jews, we also have the so-called three great Jewish tribes. Now, I'm not sure how great they were. I mean, as regards size, it might be the case that they were actually not where the Jewish life of Medina was centered. I would suggest that the Jewish population, and this is of course hypothetical, but the Jewish population of Aus and Hazraj probably was bigger than the so-called great three, the three great Jewish tribes. But that's very conjectural and can be rejected.
Why, in your view, are Christians not mentioned in the constitution?
That probably boils down to the fact, or at least probability, that there probably were not that many Christians in Medina. There probably were some, but it would seem that Medina was majority Jewish. That's my interpretation of the evidence, at least. And there were some Christians living there. We have some mentions in Arabic historical tradition of some Medinan Christians. We discussed Abu Amr Abd Amr already, who was a Medinan Christian. So there were probably some, but they were probably in the minority. So perhaps if they are sort of implicitly mentioned in the constitution, then that's because they simply were so few that they are not mentioned there, or perhaps I mean, among Aus and Khazraj there were not so many Christians that at all, maybe that they for that reason are not mentioned in the constitution.
In relation to what you've already beautifully explained about the different Quranic social categories like Muminun, Ummah, Mushrikun, etc., how does the Constitution of Medina articulate these social categories, and does it fit with your analysis?
Yeah, it seems to fit quite well. I mean, it seems to use the word mu'minun, or believers, in sort of two levels. So sort of like a super category, all the believers, but also in some clauses it would seem to use it in particular in relations to the sort of pagan believers of pagan background. So and then say that perhaps the Mu'minun are something and the Yahud or the Jews are something, right? But then there are some passages in the constitutions that seem to suggest that mu'minun is sort of like a supercategory also, so it seems to function into two categories. Interesting though that the word Muslimun appears a couple of times in the constitution, as it is quoted in the surviving versions, and it's difficult. I would suggest that those are probably later interpolations. I mean, we have to factor in the fact that this text was transmitted for around 100 years or so, 150 years, before it ended up in these, books that survived to us, right? So it was copied and perhaps somewhat modified by the copyists, and some copies somewhere might have easily, even without thinking about it, changed some appearance of mu'minun into muslimun, because by his time, by the copyist time, I mean, they were the same thing, basically. Muslimun and mu'minun basically were synonymous. So, but that can be debated and rejected. And of course, there are some passages in the Quran where Muslimun is used as a designation for the community of the believers, but it seems to be quite often as a sort of like a secondary category or name or what have you for the group. So it's somewhat difficult to say how to understand those occurrences of Muslimun in the constitution. It can be debated.
Why in the Medinan period does the Quran become more critical of the people of the book? Did differences in belief and ritual practice start to create firmer demarcations between them and the Prophet's followers, producing a reified concept of Islam in the Prophet's lifetime, as some scholars like Nikolai Sinai have suggested?
To answer the latter question, I think to an extent, perhaps, yes, there's some sort of firmer demarcation between Judaism, Christianity, and then, the community of the believers in the Medinan period as compared to the Meccan period. But I don't think that there's very clear or complete or categorical break, even in the Medinan period. So it's true that in the Meccan period, all the mentions of the people of the book are positive, all of them, if I'm not mistaken. That's what I think I state in the book, at least. In the Medinan period, not all of them are positive, but that doesn't, of course, mean that there's a complete break, right? I mean, there's shades of positive and negative descriptions in the Medinan surahs, definitely. But some of them are positive still, some neutral, and some negative. I would say that they sort of even out. So even in the Medinan period, we don't have, as I argue, the category of al-Islam or Muslimun present, or at least it doesn't mean like Muslims to the exclusion of Jews and Christians. It just means people who are obedient towards God and the Prophet, right? So we don't have that social category. We don't have any name for that group, and people in sociology and social psychology have thought about how social categorization work, and most, if not all, say that naming a group, whether it's your own group or some other, naming the other group, this is very important for social categorization and drawing the boundary and making the difference. So if there's not a social category that would make the difference, since also, of course, probably Christians call themselves mu'minun. Are there other factors? I suppose is the question. And Nikolai Sinai has suggested that there, some aspects such as the pilgrimage, for instance, and fasting could have been or probably made that boundary towards Jews and Christians. And I would answer, and in the book I answer, by saying that there are also passages in the Quran that seem to suggest that some sort of like pluralism in how you understand religious practice is actually allowed. So Surah Al-Ma'idah, some verses actually say that, each community has been given a path, and then there are other verses in the same surah that say that, Jews should follow the Torah, and the Christians should follow the Injil or the Gospel. So in those verses, it would seem to me the Quran says that it is okay to an extent for different sub-communities to have different religious practice. And also, I'm not sure if we know well enough what sort of religious practices obtained during the Prophet's lifetime. I mean, on the basis of the Quran, if you try to reconstruct how the Prophet or his followers prayed, that gets really tricky. I mean, you really have to rely on the Hadith corpora to make any claims.
And from what I understand, there's not a single hadith that lays out from beginning to end how you're supposed to pray. It seems like there's a collection of hadiths that are put together to kind of form Muslim ritual prayer.
Right. Yeah. I think that's correct. And so that I think there's quite a bit of questions. I'm not sure if, as regards this issue, any new evidence will ever come to light. I don't think, even though we might discover more inscriptions or other, material evidence that is contemporary to the Prophet, I don't think any of it will address, praying in any detail. None of our evidence that comes from pre-Islamic Arabia, as far as I know, addresses the issue of praying, for instance, even though we have, like I mentioned, Jews and Christians in script, but they never mention, like how this person prayed in, and so that evidence is probably never going to come to light, I think. So if you take all of these things into consideration, I think still in the Medinan period, the Quran accepts some of the people of the book as real, authentic believers. Here, of course, probably it means that those people were followers of the Prophet rather than just some Medinan Jews who did not in any way follow the Prophet Muhammad. And here I think my interpretation differs to some extent from Fred Donner's, who I think, if I've read him correctly, is more willing to accept that there were also, in addition to these Muhammad following Jews and Christians, there were also these other Jews and Christians who were considered believers and so on. And I'm not sure if that is the case. I think there were Jews and Christians, in addition to people of pagan background, who joined the Prophet's movement without any formal conversion. And because of this affiliation with the Prophet's movement, they are called believers.
What do you make of the Quran accusation accusing the people of the book of tahrif, and the fact that the Quran is seemingly more critical of Jews than Christians? what would be the best contextual approach to read these and other polemical passages and try to understand how they were interpreted by Jews and Christians in the prophet's milieu?
Yeah, the tahrif passages in the Quran are not so numerous. There are only a couple of them, if I'm not mistaken. So if you even though in later Islamic theology, tahrif becomes like a very common topic for theologians to discuss and jurists as well, various Muslim scholars discuss this as a very common way how they sort of maintain Muslim identity vis-a-vis Jews and Christians, is to say that, you know, we are the only community that has an authentic divine revelation. The other communities have corrupted their scriptures, even though, like, according to this view, those scriptures might have been authentic in the past, but at some point in history, Jews and Christians corrupted them, and you know they are not, at least you know, completely in full. They are not sort of authentic scripture. But the Quranic sort of proof texts are not so many for that view, and they seem to, in my reading at least, address in particular the issue of how to interpret those scriptures. And so the polemics against Jews and Christians in this context is, in my opinion, slight only, and not a very like powerful polemic and full rejection of those communities and their scriptures. And as regards to context, there are late antique Jewish and Christian discussions where various groups were blaming themselves as having misunderstood or to some extent falsified even the scripture. And of course, that's a common Christian claim against Judaism and Jews, that they have not understood the passages in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, to use a Christian designation, that in the Christian's view sort of prophesies that Jesus will come. I mean, especially in the different prophetical books in the Hebrew Bible, Christians saw these prophecies, so-called prophecies of Jesus, and they were blaming Jews that they have, you know, falsified or misunderstood the scripture because they don't understand this. And various Christian groups were also claiming that they are misunderstanding the scripture, which of course for them would include the New Testament as well. So if we take that sort of sometimes very polemical environment, late antique environment, into account, I think the Quranic accusations of tahrif are not, you know, very powerful in the sense that they would categorically say that these scriptures are wrong. Rather, the tahrif passages of the Quran only seem to suggest that the interpretation of some passages of these scriptures are incorrect.
But not the transmission of it, of the scripture, more so
Yeah, right.
interpretation. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there are many instances where Quran says that it you know, is a musaddiq of earlier scriptures, and then there are even passages in the Quran which I mentioned in the book, where it is said that, you know, the believers should go to the kitab, the scriptures, and see what is said about something there. And, you know, from a sort of later perspective, of course, and if you look at what the tafasir say, they say, of course, that al-kitab means the Quran. But if you take into account the fact that the Quran did not exist as a book between two covers, but it was a growing corpus of revelatory message, and also the fact that the Quran quite often uses the word al-kitab to mean the Bible, then I think that that specific Quran passage, for instance, says that, going to see what the Bible says about something is actually a good thing.
And that's a really, what you just explained about how the kind of accusations of tahrif can be contextualized. That's such an important insight, because it shows that the Quran isn't necessarily bringing new polemical sort of statements. It is just reflecting the discourse that was occurring between Jews and Christians already in that environment.
Yeah.
According to sort of the interpretation of the Quranic social categorization you've posited in your book and you just talked about, to be considered a believer at the time of the Prophet, one would have to accept his leadership and prophetic role, at least to some degree. But what of the afterlife, the hereafter? Does the Quran suggest that the people of the book could attain paradise without accepting Muhammad as a prophet? And what is the Quranic view on salvation sort of novel for its religious environment?
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, here the Quranic evidence is not so numerous. We only have a couple of verses that are relevant for this question, but it's important and interesting that these passages such as, or these verses such as 262 and especially 569 from the Surah Al-Ma'idah are probably very late among the the late Quranic revelations, the very late layer of the Quran, right? So even at the very late stage, the Quran in 569, which states that in addition to the believers or sort of all the believers, or perhaps the believers' pagan background, and Jews, Christians, and Sabians will receive a heavenly reward. So, and in this couple of verses, the idea that they should accept the Prophet Muhammad as a prophet and a leader is not mentioned at all. So I would suggest that there's two different social categorizations. So I mean, there are these Jews and Christians that believed in the Prophet Muhammad, and they are called believers in the Medinan period. I think in Meccan period it's more inclusivist actually, but it becomes somewhat more exclusivist in the Medinan period. You have to be you have to follow the Prophet Muhammad and take part in the community activities, defend the community, for instance. As the Constitution of Medina makes clear, you have to defend Medina against an attack that might come from an outside enemy. So in order to be a believer, you have to do that, be a active participant in the community and accept the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad. But then other verses from the Quran suggest that there might be this more inclusivist hereafter. And that is actually, I suggest, very much in line with some strands of late antique thought and discussions. I mean, especially in Judaism, this understanding of that also the Gentiles will have a portion in the world to come is dominant. It's very key in rabbinic Judaism. Of course, there are some passages in the Talmud that say that they won't get a portion, but the majority of the rabbis in the Talmud say that this is the case. They will have a portion of the hereafter, of the reward of the hereafter. And there were some Christians who thought that as well. And of course, that's not unusual. Christianity evolved, on side with Judaism. They were in the same environment and they were, discussing the same questions and sometimes with each other, right? But that's a very minority view among Christians at the time and later in the medieval era as well. So Christianity has always been more exclusivist when it comes. The official Christian view has been more exclusivist when it comes to hereafter. If we compare that to the Jewish view and also the Quranic and also later Islamic view. I mean, there's a rich tradition of Islamic theology that puts forward a inclusivist or somewhat inclusivist afterlife.
Given, you know, this, your book and our discussion has focused so much on the Quran as like a historical source for understanding the Prophet and his movement, there's obviously a growing consensus in the field now that at least the majority of the Quranic text goes back to the revelations of the Prophet. For you, do you see any future possibility of that ever being challenged via a multiple authors thesis? And how do you feel that the sort of the conclusions that you reach in your book will either will prevent that, maybe that thesis from emerging?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mean, the idea of sort of multiple authors is alive. I mean, it's been put forward by Stephen Shoemaker and Thomas Otese and some other scholars. So it's in the minority, but it's alive. It's something that, you know, should be considered. But at the moment, I don't see much or any evidence for that. And I mean, the people who espouse that view should really discover, of course, I mean, or put forward some material evidence that would speak to that and be evidence for that. So if Quranic manuscripts or, you know, portions of Quranic or proto-Quranic or whatever you're going to call it, manuscripts at some point surface that somehow was evidence for that, then I would perhaps reconsider my views. But I definitely think that it's very well evidenced and established that the Quranic text, you know, the vast majority of it or totality of it goes back to the revelatory message of the Prophet Muhammad. I really believe that at the moment. Of course, like, new evidence might change my view and the field's view of that, but the evidence is not there yet. I mean, especially if you look at Stephen Shoemaker's book, Creating the Quran, his argument, to a degree at least, rests on the assumption that Mecca and Medina were these Christ-barren, non-Christian regions. And he states that, you know, the Quran has a lot of narratives that reflect Christian narratives and discourses. Quran mentions the Christians, Nasara, and if they were lacking in Mecca and Medina, of course, that would, you know, suggest that those passages might come from somewhere else in time and place. But since I think that the Christian presence in Arabia, including Western Arabia and including Hijaz, is well established in the epigraphic record, I don't think that there's any reason to doubt the sort of the conventional view of the formation of the Quranic corpus. But like I said, I'm open for you know, new suggestions and interpretations, but I would really like to see them backed with some material or tangible evidence.
Your analysis of the Quran relies heavily on the great Islamic scholar Theodore Noldike, who is still talked about and referenced even 100 years later, amazingly. You rest heavily on his chronological division of the surahs. Why do you view his chronology as sound? And is there any aspect of it that could be problematic in your view?
Yeah, this is of course an important question and would sort of affect my reconstruction of the sort of the social categories also in Mecca and Medina quite heavily if Nöldecke's division proved to be unsound. Well, first, of course, Nöldecke's division is based on sort of classical Islamic scholars' division of these surahs into Meccan and Medinan periods. He suggested some new subdivisions to Meccan periodization, and of course also in some cases suggests that there are these Medinan additions to Meccan surahs and so on, which to a degree the classical Islamic tradition acknowledges, but perhaps not so much as Nöldecke was willing to acknowledge that there are these later sort of Medinan interpolations into Meccan surahs. Why I think it's to a degree sound is that if you follow it to reconstruct, for instance, the sort of religious history of Mecca and Medina, as I've tried to do in the book, it comes across and really offers quite clear development or some sort of development as having taken place that seems to be very, commonsensical and sound. I mean that in Meccan period, for instance, there's somewhat different social categories as there are in Medinan period. If Nöldecke's division was completely amiss, I think that we had much more, problems in trying to put forward any reconstructions on the basis of that. You would see like Medinan passages that have a very Meccan social categorization going on, but you don't really see that. And in one article called The One Community, and it's a longer title, where I look at especially the Constitution of Medina compared to the Quranic material, and of course I do that to a degree in the book as well. Also, it would seem that it is in particular in late Meccan surahs that we see similar or the same social categorization as in the Constitution of Medina, which is supposed to be a very early Medinan text, right, from a very early. So that makes a lot of sense, once again, that you see these sort of developments in maybe theological thinking, also legal materials that in Mecca are quite rare to see any sort of addressing of any legal issues, I mean, including diet and purity and all that. But then in Medina, when we have, at least according to the conventional narrative, we have a community where the leader of that community, the Prophet Muhammad, quite naturally would have, addressed certain issues as regards law. Then in Medinan periods of the Quran, we see that sort of theme emerge and evolve. So I just think that it makes a lot of sense, and of course Nikolai Sinai and other people have also done some quantitative studies where they have looked at mean verse lengths, so how long the verses are in general in some surah, and that too seems to suggest some formal and formal development in the Quran, which aligns pretty well with this division that Nöldecke put forward, which is of course, like I said, based on classical Muslim scholars' portrayal of the Meccan and Medina surahs.
In your book, you survey some textual sources and the archaeological record from the 7th century after the prophet's death. How do you feel they support your conclusions about the content and context of his religious mission?
Yeah. So, like I mentioned in the beginning, I really wanted to sort of offer continuous narrative of the religious groups and phenomena in Arabia from 300 to 700 or thereabouts, and sort of try to overcome the conventional pre-Islamic, early Islamic, or that sort of categorization, problematize that a little bit. And that, of course, means that, which might be problematic, I suppose, from methodological point of view, that you have to go to very different sources for different periods, because for, from one period, you have one source that is important as a contemporary source and maybe comes from that very environment, and for another period you have to look at other sources. For the 7th century, we have, of course, quite a bit of inscriptions, to begin with, in Arabic. Then we have these fantastic non-Arabic sources, and then we, of course, have sort of the first examples of sort of the developing and burgeoning sort of Muslim scholarship that starts, especially if you think about historiography, it starts with Urwa ibn Zubair and other figures, important figures in Medina who lived in the late 7th century. So we start to see those sources emerge as well. So we have quite a bit of sources for the 7th century, actually. And one thing that has been, in many instances in the book, I've tried to problematize sort of the conventional views that people have, which I think can be rejected on the basis of material evidence and other contemporary evidence. And one convention, of course, is to think that Arabia became Islamicized very soon after the Prophet Muhammad's death, and all the Jews and Christians were either converted or then removed, expelled from Arabian Peninsula. You have in the Ibn Hisham's Sirah and some other sources, you have this narrative about the Prophet Muhammad, that one of his last wishes was that there not be any Jews and Christians left in Arabian Peninsula. Now, classical Muslim scholars were, of course, aware of the problem that there were actually some Jews and Christians living in Arabian Peninsula, and they understood that tradition as pertaining to only a part of Arabian Peninsula. But they, of course, quite often included Mecca and Medina to that area, so the Hijaz sort of area in general. So I looked into this and in the book, and it seems that even in Arabia and even in Hijaz, we have Jews and Christians living quite much later, much later than the supposed conversion or expulsion of Jews and Christians from Arabia. So we have some epigraphic sources that seem to suggest that. The dating of those sources is problematic, though, or can be debated. But then we have even Muslim scholars stating that near Medina there were a large number of Jews living around the year 1000, and then we have some Jewish sources stating the same. And in particular in southern part of the peninsula, there was quite sizable Jewish and Christian population much later. So I really wanted to problematize this notion of very quick expansion of the caliphate during the caliphates of Abu Bakr and Umar, because quite often it's viewed that by Umar's time, there were hardly no Jews and Christians around, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
And what evidence can be used to sort of chart how the Prophet's sort of more inclusivist religious movement developed into an exclusivist Islamic identity by the time much of the more classical texts of Islamic historiography were produced, like the Sirah literature documented by Ibn Hisham, for example? And what sort of semantic shifts are documented in this sort of transition period?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we see, and this we see actually in the sort of dated material evidence, that by the early 8th century Common Era, the social category of Muslims, Muslimun, in the using that word Muslimun, is really there. So that's one thing, and it's contrasted to Jews and Christians. So that word, al-Islam, Muslimun, that are Quranic, of course, start to mean a religious tradition and group that is apart from Jews and Christians. And then other terms, Quranic terms such as deen, which we've discussed, accrue different meanings and starts to mean a religion, a religious group, a religious tradition. So that's my reading of the material, at least. And then the whole notion of there having been Jews and Christians among the Prophet Muhammad's followers without conversion becomes problematic for many of these Arabic historians. And that many of them reject that idea wholesale, but even in Ibn Hisham's work and Al-Waqidi and other sort of key early sources, classical Arabic biographies of the Prophet, we see some examples of these sort of blurred boundaries, or how you want to define that early stage of when there were some, according to my argument at least, there were some Jews and Christians that were among the followers of the Prophet. And I mentioned the migration to Ethiopia as sort of like a nexus of these narratives. But also there are some others. I mean, there's the famous or quite famous figure, Mohairiq, a rabbi who fights for the Prophet Muhammad and for the community, and is killed in one of the battles, in Uhud, if I remember correctly. And most narratives that mention Muhairaq only say that he was a rabbi. Some view this as problematic and say that he actually had converted to Islam. But if we, from the Quranic standpoint, the whole notion of conversion to a religious tradition called Islam seems to be problematic as a sort of like historical reality, then it becomes very unlike that there would have been a sort of like a formal conversion of this figure Muhairaq. And indeed, like I mentioned, like many of the Arabic narrative sources just mentioned that he was a rabbi fighting for the community.
Thank you so much for your patience and for being willing to go through so many of our questions. We were so eager to ask all of these because we found your work so fascinating. We have reached our final question, which is that you note in your conclusion that one of the things you hope that your book achieves is demonstrating that problematizing the Islamic historiographical tradition or relegating it maybe to a role of a secondary source does not mean stepping into like a historical void. And why do you present the relinquishing of this tradition to be more of an optimistic scenario in terms of reconstructing the Prophet's life and those of his followers?
Yeah, I suppose that was a bit polemically put in the book. What I just wanted to highlight is that we actually have this contemporary evidence now, and like I mentioned, the epigraphic record of the corpus is burgeoning. People, come back from the field with new inscriptions. So it does not, even because for a long time, the discussions of early Islamic history in academic scholarship usually started with discussing the various source critical issues that we have, and then ending up with saying that, well, we cannot really say anything, and the Hijaz is an empty space for us. We cannot really go there. It's a void, really. But what I try to state in the book is that that's not actually true in light of the new epigraphic evidence, and in particular, if we want to accept the poetical corpus as authentic to a degree, at least, which I do. And then also, I mean, I think it's an optimistic development in the sense that the fact that there's a more or less consensus in the field that the Quran is a contemporary source for the and it can be used as a contemporary source in historical studies to reconstruct the Prophet's lives and his community. So now that there is some consensus on the issue, even though there are, of course, some scholars who do not agree with this view, I think we can move forward and really use, like, of course, the Quran has been used for a number of years, but you know, maybe historians have not been so willing to engage with the Quran. So I think there's a lot to be discovered by using the Quran as well as a historical source. So that I mean by presenting this as an optimistic scenario. And I think also, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning that in my opinion, we have much better sources to reconstruct the life of the historical Muhammad than the historical Jesus in academic scholarship. And if this is acknowledged, I really hope that there will be so many books on Muhammad's life as there has been on Jesus' life, which of course are a multitude. So to me, it seems that historians have sort of shied away from discussing the Prophet Muhammad's life because they have thought that there's so many issues with the sources. I would suggest that there's, hopefully many new studies that come and sort of also take into consideration the epigraphic record of Arabian and Arabic poetry. I think I can only, scrape the surface in the book. I think there's so much interesting stuff that can be discovered in that corpus, and also, like, I haven't so much used, if I at all, in the book, like poetry that was composed, at least supposedly composed, by the Prophet Muhammad's followers. That should definitely be the subject of much academic inquiry. And if people accept certain parameters and sort of there's some consensus of some issues, then I think the historians can really start to look at the Sira narratives with new eyes as well. I mean, one of the key insight of historical Jesus studies is that you should keep the context in mind, and if there's material in the Gospels, one of the Gospel narratives that is improbable or impossible because Judaism back in the day was very different, and Jesus could not have said that, then that's just rejected. Accordingly, if people agree, and of course I'm happy if people disagree as well. If people agree that there were a number of Jews and Christians around, and monotheism was really central in Arabian religious life, then maybe the Sira narratives can be sort of reread in that light, and the perhaps more authentic materials in that vast corpus of text can be sort of discovered or rediscovered, so to speak.
All right. And again, thank you for your time. This was a wonderful discussion. Your book was a really enlightening and accessible read, and I recommend it to all of our audience. It's available for purchase, and I believe it can be downloaded as an ebook. Yeah, again, thank you. It was, is there anything that you would like to say before we take off? Are you working on anything coming out, anything we can expect from you in terms of research?
Well, like I mentioned, the zero narratives, I think when read in sort of new light and in tandem with more material evidence, I think there's a lot of promise and interesting possibilities there. So I really try to focus on Arabic historical tradition more in the future. That's my sort of goal, and some studies that I'm working on.
And the field looks really bright. I feel like we're kind of a little bit past the whole deconstruction stage to a certain degree, and it seems like more scholars are trying to reconstruct based on the latest findings. So, it's a really exciting field at the moment, and I'm just happy to be a witness to it all. So, again, Dr. Lindstedt, thank you for your time, and thank you for all of your hard work. People can find you on social media, where you share various insights into your work. And again, this was an excellent talk. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.